Okay, we are going to do another round of practice with the quadratic formula, and I'm introducing a new idea / skill in this quadratic formula. So we are going to do quadratic formula, and we're going to include no solution. So we've had quadratics with exponents before that have no factors. And so you weren't able to factor them. And so we talked about how if you couldn't factor, right, this can't be factored, this quadratic can't be factored, there's no factoring, but there's still a solution to this equation, right? So we found the solution by using the quadratic formula, which is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, right? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, right? So we were able to, when you can't factor, right, there's no way to factor this problem, we've been able to go back to the quadratic, or go forward to the quadratic formula and use the quadratic formula to find our answers. But there are going to be some quadratics out there that do not have answers. They're impossible to do. And we're going to talk about what these answers are in our next section. But some of our problems are going to have no solution, right? You're going to be solving these quadratics, and this problem has no solution. There's no answer to the problem. There's no way to find this answer. So your answer that you're going to write down for some of these problems is going to be one ordered pair. Sometimes it's one ordered pair that happens twice. And then the other one is that you would have two different ordered pairs. But now we're also going to have a third type of answer that we could possibly have, and that's a no solution type of answer. So we still follow our same steps from the previous section, right? The equation must equal 0. Then we substitute into the formula. We simplify with the formula, and we try to solve it. But at step 4 is where it's going to get a little wonky. So we're going to talk about this. So some problems, not all, again, and just because there's a no solution, kind of like when we did equations, I don't necessarily enjoy teaching no solutions because I feel like it's sometimes students are like, oh, no solution, no solution, no solution. My calculator looks weird. Always double check. If you get an answer that's a no solution, just double check, stop, and think through this process just to make sure, because it can be easy to make a mistake. So we need it to be in standard form. Right, in order to do this, we're going to substitute into the quadratic formula. We're going to simplify. And there's going to be something in this substituting into the quadratic formula and simplification process that you do when you simplify it. There's going to be a big red flag that's going to jump out at you. And then if you continue to go on, your calculator will say error or something like that. Depending on what your calculator looks like, there's going to be an error with it. And that's when we get to that point, it's a no solution. And there's something in here, and we'll talk about it in a second, that will allow you to look at it and, again, rethink once you see this step right here that's going to have a red flag, this error, just stop and think to yourself, okay, is this following that rule of why it's going to be a no solution? So again, remember the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to talk about a no solution type problem. So for example, I'm telling you already this is going to be a no solution. But if we had the problem negative 12x squared minus 2x minus 12 equals, let's say 8x. I'm going to subtract 8x. I have negative 12x squared plus 10x. Nope, that should be minus. Where'd my whiteout go? Uh-oh. Did a cat steal it? She must have. That should be a minus 10x minus 12 equals 0. If I don't want to deal with the negative, I can take that out. You can leave the negative in there. I'm just going to take that negative out just because I don't want to have to deal with it. So I'm now going to go through and find A equals and B equals and C equals. So my A value is 12, my B value is 10, and my C value is 12. So I'm going to use the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of B, so negative 10, plus or minus the square root of B, which is 10 squared, minus 4 times 12 times 12, A and C, all of that over 2 times 12. I'm going to simplify it to get negative 10 plus or minus the square root, and 10 squared is 100 minus, and I'm going to grab my calculator, four times 12 times 12 is 576 all over 24. I'm going to simplify that again to get negative 10 plus or minus the square root, and 100 minus 576 is negative 476 divided by 24. And here's where I'm going to stop. Because I have the square root of a negative value. You can't do that. You cannot do the square root of a negative value, because in order to get a negative number, right? Let's pretend that this just said, oh, let's do 400, right? If it was 400, you'd ask yourself, what times what equals 400, right? You'd have to say the square root of something, right, is the same number times the same number, and that would be 20 times 20. But it's negative, so the only way to get a negative is to have one positive and one negative, and therefore they're not the same number. The square root of 476, positive 476, is 476. The square root of that is basically 21.8 times 21.8. 21.8 times 21.8. Now I'm rounding, so it's going to be a little bit off. But, I mean, it's fairly close, right? And I rounded, so it's not exact. But to get a negative, you'd have to have one positive, and one negative. And since they're not the same value, you can't do it. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So this is no solution. There's no answer to this problem. This is a no solution type problem. Let's do another one just for good measure, just so that we can get that practice of seeing that. Again, remember when we did the other problem, right? When we did these other problems, we ended up with a positive value in the square root section. And the positive value inside the square roots, we can do that. That's doable. A positive number can have a square root of it. A negative number, we can't do that yet. That comes along in Algebra 2. We in Algebra 1 don't have the ability to do a square root of a negative number, and so this is a no solution. Let's do just one more practice. So 11a squared plus 12. Oh, I'm doing this backwards. Just kidding. Let's do 11a squared. No, that's not going to work. Hold on, I have to find a problem. Let's do negative 11a squared plus 8a minus 9 equals 0. There we go. I'm going to take out the negative just because I don't want to have to deal with as many negatives as I can. You can leave that negative in there and work with it, that's fine. Because again, we're not factoring. But this way I just have fewer negatives to deal with. My a value is 11, my b value is negative 8, and my c value is 9. I'm going to do x equals negative b, so this time it's positive, plus or minus the square root of negative 8 squared, which is okay, because negative 8 times negative 8 turns into a positive, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. I'm going to simplify that to be 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus, and 4 times 11 times 9. 4 times 11 times 9 is 396. And all of that over 2a, which is 22. I'm going to simplify one more time. 8 plus or minus the square root. 64 minus 396 is negative 332 divided by 22. And I'm going to stop because, again, I cannot do the square root of a negative number. 332, negative 332, and the square root of that is an error. If you have one of these calculators, the square root of negative 332 is an error. We cannot do the square root of a negative number, so we would have no solution, because again, we cannot do the square root of a negative value. It's not going to happen on every problem. They will happen occasionally now because we know how to do them. But if you get a negative value when you simplify in that next step, when you simplify, if you get that simplification and it's a negative value, it's a no solution because you cannot do the square root of a negative number. If you get the simplification and you get a positive value, keep going because you can do the square root of a positive value, because again, the only way to get a negative number is a positive times a negative. And if you have a positive value and a negative value, it cannot have the square root of it because they're not the same number.